And you were saying that human trafficking usually starts with the family. So did human trafficking for you start when you ran away from home? How did that actually start happening? Did you maybe use sex as a way to make money? How did that happen in your life?
Well, it's also important to recognize that only 1/4 of all victims of human trafficking are under the age of 18. I was actually 18 the first time I was trafficked. And this man that I had been dating was more than twice my age. He was one of the predators who saw that I had a vulnerability and a need in my life, and he promised to fill that need. The biggest one that I had at the time was I needed shelter, and I desperately needed somebody to love me. So he promised me these two things. Once he had me completely dependent on him, he felt like, okay, now I can start getting her to do whatever I want her to do. And he loaned me out as a trade favor for his best friend's birthday party. I was locked up in a hotel room in Las Vegas for 52 hours and repeatedly assaulted. At the end of the 52 hours, we went back to where I was living at the time, which was Arizona. And I grabbed my stuff and I left as quickly as I could. I found a place to go and I left. But that doesn't sound like what you hear or what you see when you see these movies about human trafficking. So it's important to also define what human trafficking is. So this isn't something that I would suggest anybody Google or look up on Wikipedia because these are fallible resources. You want to look somewhere like the Department of Homeland Defense or the Department of Homeland Security. They define human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain labor or sex acts from another person. So if you notice, there's no mention of transportation, even though our brains think traffic means trafficking, like being out on the street. There's no mention of money. So prostitution does not equal human trafficking and vice versa. And there's no mention of, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, you can see where I'm going with this. It's a very open definition. It's totally different from grabbing some kid off the street and forcing them into commercial sex acts. I was repeatedly raped. I was not out there acting as though I was a prostitute who was eager to earn money. I was locked into a small hotel room and told if I left this hotel room, I wouldn't be able to get back in because I didn't have a room key. I couldn't have my driver's license. They had a control over it. I couldn't get back to where I was living and get my stuff ever again. And I had very little things at the time, but I still wanted my things. I had to put up with what was being done to me for 52 hours to have a shot to get back. But at that point, I had been molested and raped at a public swimming pool by a stranger when I was 12, by an uncle when I was 13, by friends that I thought were my friends when I was 15, 16. I was raped at 17. I had already been through so much that I thought to myself, it's only 52 hours. I've been through worse. I can get through this too. And that's such a dangerous mindset that we have. So I was trafficked 3 different times in my life. The second time was when I was 19, when a pair of landlords sold me as a commodity to a guy named Esteban, who was then going to pass me on to somebody else. Just sold us as basically, essentially a slave. The third time I was trafficked, I was 31 years old. So this was after I had finally established myself in the world and had a solid, steady job. I had been in a long-distance relationship with this man for 7 years. He lived in Scotland. I lived in California. He asked me to get a fiancé visa and move to Scotland to be with him. And I dropped everything. I quit my job. I sold my car, got rid of my apartment, and I jumped on a plane and flew to Scotland. And the first 7 days were wonderful, but it only took him 7 days to start trafficking me after taking 7 years to get me there. He was a police officer.
Wow, that's deep. That's a lot to unravel there. It almost seemed like in your life it just happened everywhere. It's like a common occurrence.
Right. And that has to do with building up these neurosynapses when you go through trauma. You know, your brain becomes involved with the survival side of things rather than living rather than having a day-to-day life experience. You're constantly in survival mode. And when this happens, you learn to be really hypervigilant. You're paying attention to everybody around you. And people confuse hypervigilancy with empathy. You're not really that, you don't have that depth of empathy. What you have is trauma response called hypervigilance, where you pay attention to every single person in the room. You think that you are empathic because you can read the moods of other people, when really what your brain is doing is telling you that person is dangerous. Figure out why, so that you can try to control the situation.
Yeah, well, that's intense because, like you're saying, the hypervigilance isn't there from the empathy; it's the fear of what that person can do to you. That's why the hypervigilance happens, because there's such a deep issue with trust and who to trust, where you're hypervigilant of everybody because you understand that potentially everybody is a threat in a way.
Right. And if you don't figure out which one is the greatest threat, you're not going to be able to keep yourself safe. This is what your brain is telling you.
Wow. Yeah, that's some deep psychological work. I don't know how people. I've heard people say this many times, that people would say, "Oh, well, you could have just left. Why didn't you leave?" But the thing is when you go through all this kind of stuff and you're always in this fight or flight, when you're always trying to, like you said, survive instead of live, and this is all you know, you can't just leave. It's not how it works, you know.
Right.
Because I hear people saying that a lot, like, "Oh, they could have just left. They put them in this situation." I mean, no, it's not. It's really not how it is, because it's such a deep psychological thing, and you're just trying to survive. Where leaving isn't always an option in a sense. Like you can't see leaving as an option, because what's out there could be even worse. You're going through all this, but at least you're surviving. You have food. You have a place out there. If you do decide to leave, it could get so much worse. You could be outside, and the same thing could be happening to you.
Right. So when I moved to Scotland, it was January, and there were 6-foot snowbanks everywhere. If I had just left that place and moved out and decided to wander on my own, first of all, he was a police officer, so there's no help from the police. And he also had my passport, my debit card, my credit card. I had nothing to say who I was. I would have gotten out there, not been able to obtain any resources or help, and I would have frozen to death. And that was my options. When I did finally get away from this guy in Scotland, I got back to the US. Just because I got away from him doesn't mean that that's where it all ended. I was constantly hunted. He came to the US looking for me, and I saw him through the peephole banging on the neighbor's door because he had my address off by a single number. He hunted me. And when that wasn't enough, he'd find out where I was working or who I was friends with. And he would share all of these photos and videos that he took of me being raped repeatedly while I was in Scotland. And he would email them to these people. And he would say something in that email about, "I wouldn't want this in my life, would you?" I lost friends. I was fired from jobs. Was constantly hunted for years. This whole time I was living in California. Finally, in 2016, I packed up and I moved to Colorado, and I'm thinking, I can start over. I'm just going to get away from all of that mess. He'll never find me again. But this is social media age, so that doesn't really happen anymore either. People can still find you. And he was constantly linking my social media and my personal information, all of this stuff, to whatever it was that he was sending out or posting. He started posting this on photo sharing websites. It became absolutely awful. He was destroying my life over and over and over and over again. In 2019, I discovered that this man made me famous on a pornography website. He had taken all these photos and videos and put them up on a porn site and included, again, my social media so that total strangers could find me and stalk me. I was recognized in a grocery store and asked for my autograph from being in a rape video on a pornography website. That's when I started digging a little deeper. I discovered that more than 85% of modern pornography is created using victims of human trafficking just like me. 85%. That's massive. That's a huge number. So I reached out to an anti-trafficking organization out here. They immediately paired me up with pro bono legal services to try to fight this happening. And they started asking that these different pornography websites take down these videos and photos. And they did. But every time one went down, two more went up. And I was fighting an uphill battle. So I reached out to another anti-trafficking organization. They paired me up with a therapist. I traumatized this woman so much that she left the industry forever. So they paired me up with another therapist. This one actually had experience of working with other survivors of trafficking. So when I went in to see her for the first time, I told her, I said, first off, do not come at me with prescription medication right off the bat. I don't want a Band-Aid. I want a shovel. And second, do not treat me like I am some fragile porcelain doll. If I was going to break, I was going to do it already. Let's get busy. Until I was ready to take these steps, my life was never going to change. I was going to constantly be that victim. I was constantly going to be attacked and victimized and brutalized. I was going to keep losing jobs. I was going to keep losing friends. And it did keep happening over and over and over again. And eventually, when I learned how to speak up for myself, that man became more afraid of me than I ever was of him. But it wasn't going to happen until I found that strength within me to start learning how to fight back. It doesn't end just because you leave. It never ends just because you leave. You will be hunted, but you have to own it. And until you own it, they can use it against you.
Yeah, wow, oh man, it's very, very powerful what you're just saying right there. That's I can't even imagine the emotions you went through, um, just over the last couple of years, just having somebody come up to you asking for an autograph, and just I'd be reliving every single moment prior to that happening. And it's crazy that you're saying is like these people, they come after you, they literally try to take your whole life away from you because it wasn't enough. They want more. It's such like a psychopathic tendency where I'm not even sure where that comes from or how to explain it. I'm not even sure how people are capable of doing those things.